everybody. Welcome to our webinar on multi-abuse trauma. This is Michelle Cooper, Health Education Specialist for PCADV.
And I'm Jessa Wyness. I'm a Training and Technical Assistant Specialist at PCADV.
And thank you so much for joining us today. This is a continuation of last month's webinar that talked about trauma and self-care. So if you did not have an opportunity to take that, that's fine. This one will stand on its own, but we do recommend that if you have a chance, you go back and view that webinar as well, because we are not going to spend as much time on the trauma aspect as we did in that webinar. So just to review our objectives quickly, at the end of this presentation, you will be able to define and recognize trauma and trauma responses. You'll be able to review the multi-abuse trauma tool and how it applies to your work. And you'll be able to discuss best practices for working with survivors and incorporating the multi-abuse trauma tool into the work that you do with them as well. So before we get into the beginning of the presentation, just like to make sure and remind everybody to take care of your needs. Always, the topics that we're going to discuss can be challenging and difficult. And as we discussed in the last webinar about self-care and secondary trauma, we're all walking around with our own stuff. And if any of the things that we covered today activate your stuff, take care of your needs, whatever that looks like. All right,
So now we're going to jump into the genesis of trauma. And as Michelle said, we took a deep dive into this in the previous webinar. So we just wanted to revisit the concept of this to establish a baseline to move forward on how to apply the tool. So when we're talking about trauma, what trauma describes is a unique individual experience. It's, a response to an emotionally and distressing experience or multiple experiences or circumstances or events that are often life-changing. It's an experience or event that overwhelms a person's ability to cope. Oftentimes it leaves folks, having different feelings and unable to process certain events. Because this experience or event of trauma is considered outside the realm of normal human experience. So it has profound effects on the individual, on their development, or their well-being also. So when we're talking about what the impact of trauma and what that experience means for the brain, this is what we're talking about. So when we're thinking about the brain, we're thinking about it in the terms of front brain and back brain. Our back brain is in charge of our emotions and reactions, where our front brain is in charge of our focus and attention. So in a non-traumatized brain, or somebody that hasn't experienced trauma, what happens is the front brain or thalamus receives an emotional signal, the emotional stimuli goes up there, and it passes it to the processing part of the brain, which is the cerebral cortex, and then back to the brain into the amygdala for it to disseminate a response. So, however, if somebody has experienced trauma or after a traumatic event, the signals from our back brain, our alpha waves, increase in slow speed, and they also move quickly to signal danger and agitation. So what that'll look like is an emotional stimuli happens, and instead of going through the processing piece, it goes straight to the amygdala. So it goes right out to develop an emotional reaction. So what's important to note, that this affects the decision-making ability of individuals that have experienced trauma and the way that their emotional reactions happen, because there is no processing time, because trauma literally has changed their brain to no longer be able to process what's happening and just develop an emotional response. So when we're talking about trauma responses, there are 3 key areas that we talk about, which are impaired filtering system, which is enabling responses to stressful personal and family relationships, and perceiving danger where none exists. There's also a disconnect between emotion and cognition. So this could be, emotions and feelings no longer fit the situation. So anger is being expressed when others are experiencing joy, or feelings of joy are dulled by feelings of pain and heartache. And that can also cause an increase in maladaptive coping skills and cause a decrease in coping skills. So then whenever that also gets paired with unaddressed trauma, which, as we know and we discussed on the previous webinar, can occur early years in childhood, so the ACE study, all of these things together can lead to maladaptive coping skills, poor mental and physical health, continual state of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, constant hypervigilance, having to feel that they have to choose between their needs, and also feeling no sense of safety, regardless of what the situation being placed in front of them is. Awesome. So this is gonna be the introduction into our tool. This is a good visual because it reminds us to think outside of the box whenever we're thinking about what trauma is, right? Because we've all had trainings on what trauma is and how trauma impacts the brain and impacts responses and what to look for. But oftentimes we forget about some of the different types of trauma that folks can have. Things like poverty and homelessness and substance abuse, how all of these things that we're gonna take a deeper dive into can also affect trauma. But it also reminds us that in addition to the presenting trauma, which for folks in our services are, a domestic violence, it can also remind us that folks have experienced other types of trauma that are co-occurring. So in essence, we can be providing services to an individual that has a presenting trauma, a trauma history, as well as a co-occurring trauma. The other thing that this tool does is to help serve us as a reminder that coping abuse, to cope with their traumatic experiences, these 3 realms of trauma, can also cause trauma. Things like eating disorder, self-mutilation, addiction, again, things that we're going to take a deeper dive into, which is why we're presenting on this today, because it's really important to see the connection between trauma and the multiple levels and the unseen traumas that are beyond just the presenting issues that folks are bringing to us.
So we're going to dive right into the tool, and like we said before, I know we just glossed over the details about trauma and trauma response because that was covered in the previous webinar. So just one more time, we encourage you to take a look at that webinar if you haven't had a chance to, so that you're able to really, synthesize all of the information that we're about to share with you. But we're very excited to be able to run through the details of the multi-abuse trauma tool with all of you. Some of you may have received this before, but you should also have this available to you as a handout along with this webinar. This is just a really good representation of what it might look like for an individual who is, walking through the world, engaging every day, carrying these multiple layers of trauma. Because as we know, these aren't just singular things that impact a person one time. Because we understand the dynamics of trauma and trauma response, these are all experiences that intersect and interact with one another during the course of an individual's life. They can be activated at different times in different ways. Sometimes they can activate each other, build off of each other. So we're going to take some time to really go into detail about some of the aspects of this tool that we felt may need a little bit more explanation. So this is the front of the handout. And then if you look on the back, you'll be able to see that there is a list of some examples of what we may mean when we say multiple layers of trauma or multi-abuse trauma. And of course, this is not an exhaustive list. So what we've compiled today are some of the things that we feel are going to be the most prevalent or significant in the clients that we work with. But it's also meant to be a reminder of all of the different things and different categories of trauma that somebody may be experiencing or walking around with. But of course, this is not the be all end all of things. So first category is interpersonal violence. We're not going to take a long time with these because obviously these are definitions that all of us should be pretty familiar with. So we're not going to take the time to define domestic violence, sexual assault, or sexual abuse. But it's important to remember that the majority of clients that we work with, obviously, especially for those of us that are in standalone domestic violence programs, will be dealing with an individual whose presenting form of trauma is domestic violence. In some cases, the presenting form of trauma may be sexual assault, but we know that interpersonal violence often co-occurs. So no matter what a person's presenting form of trauma is, we need to remember that they may have experienced previously or may currently be experiencing other forms of interpersonal violence that they may not have disclosed or felt comfortable sharing. The other thing, and Jessa mentioned this earlier, with regard to the ACE study and the impact of trauma developmentally, Child abuse can have a significant impact on an individual. This can include physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, any of those aspects of violence that occur during the developmental years can absolutely have an impact on an individual throughout the rest of their life. And once again, we went into this in a bit more detail regarding the ACE study. So these are things to bear in mind as well with an individual that you're working with. We know that very oftentimes if abuse has occurred in someone's past, they carry the trauma of that with them, and that can be activated by current abusive behaviors or factors that we may not even have access or be privy to, because once again, an individual may not disclose that these things have occurred. So now we're going to get into some coexisting conditions. And once again, we're not going to take a lot of time to go into detail about these, because these are things that we feel pretty much everybody has a general idea about. So things like post-traumatic stress disorder, mental illness, psychiatric conditions, physical disabilities, and developmental disabilities. These are all things that tend to co-occur. They exist together, and they may have more than one kind of manifestation. So we can't take for granted the impact that these may have on an individual. Even something that we may not define as traumatic, like mental illness, can still have a traumatic baseline. Trauma history may be responsible for or may contribute to individuals' ability to cope with or manage a mental illness or any of these coexisting conditions. So these are important things to remember and to be aware of. And we, as all of you know, as advocates, can't take for granted somebody's experience of these coexisting conditions. So as we all know, one person's ability to manage a developmental disability can look vastly different from another individual's ability to do so. And some of that may carry its own forms of trauma or may activate other forms of trauma depending on the environment that that individual is in. So now we're going to talk about coping abuse, and this is something that we are going to take a little bit more time to talk about. So these that are in bold are some categories that we're going to take some time to really dig into and define, because they tend to be things that we don't necessarily understand as well, or that we may see evidence of, but we may kind of give them, credit in a different way. So for example, with things like alcohol or substance abuse, we may not see that necessarily as a form of coping, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later on in the webinar, but we may attribute some of the impact of these coping abuse strategies to different things. So in particular, we feel like things like self-neglect, alcohol, and substance abuse are categories that all of you should have some information about. And once again, if you have questions about the ones that we're not going into detail about, you're welcome to ask questions or reach out for more information about those. But next, we're going to talk about the bolded items in a little bit more detail so that you can have an idea of what we mean when we say eating disorder, disassociation, and self-mutilation.
Yeah, and an important note before we move forward with taking a deeper dive into these things, the list that we're talking about, is that these are not to be used as a diagnosis tool. We are not clinicians. We are not, I know there are some folks that are like licensed social workers, but in the terms of the DV work that we do, this is not meant to be used as a diagnostic tool. We're just presenting this so that you are able to recognize the different types of impacts of trauma, the different layers of trauma, the different ways that, in this case, for this next discussion about coping skills, coping abuse. So it's just really important to note that while some of these things have clinical background or are able to be diagnosed, that's not our job. We're just here to help name them. So if you're witnessing these things as a trauma response, just to help you to better in your advocacy to support that survivor and what their needs are, rather than kind of outing them as, I don't know what this is, this doesn't make sense, you don't fit in our services kind of stuff. So I did just want to give that disclaimer before we move forward.
Excellent.
Cool. So going into eating disorders, some types of eating disorders include anorexia nervosa. So whenever we're talking about eating disorders, they're treatable, but a very serious mental and physical illness. It can affect people of all genders, ages, races, religions, ethnicities, sexual orientations, body shapes, and weights. When trauma experiences are being internalized, often one of the easiest ways to feel in control is to control your body, to control what it looks like and what it consumes. So along with, again, coupled with media pressures, cultural expectation, and abusive tactics that an individual may have experienced, this can manifest in a variety of ways. So when we're talking about anorexia nervosa, it's categorized by weight loss or a lack of appropriate weight gain through growth, difficulties in maintaining an appropriate body weight for height, age, and stature, and in many individuals, a distorted body image. People with anorexia generally restrict the number of calories and the types of food they eat. Some folks with this disorder also exercise compulsively and can purge via vomiting and laxative abuse or binge eat. So this can present as food rituals, avoiding meal times or eating in public. So for folks in shelter, not eating with other members of shelter, refusing to eat certain food groups, being very preoccupied with weight, and holding a really inflexible thinking process around food and nutrition and food groups. Bulimia nervosa is characterized by a cycle of binging and compensatory behaviors such as self-induced vomiting, designed to undo or compensate for the effects of binge eating. This can present as extreme concern with body weight and shape, purges after a binge, creating a lifestyle of scheduling and rituals to make time to binge and purge. They can steal or hoard food in strange places. So again, in shelter, this could look like hoarding food in a closet or a bottom drawer of a dresser. Again, it relies heavily on food rituals. So only eating particular food or food groups, excessive chewing, or doesn't allow foods to touch. When we're talking about binge eating disorder, it's characterized by recurrent episodes of eating large quantities of food, often very quickly to the point of discomfort, a feeling of loss of control during a binge, experiencing shame, distress, or guilt afterwards, and not regularly using unhealthy measures. So they do not purge to counter the binge eating. This can present as frequently dieting, evidence of binge eating, including disappearance of large foods in short periods of time, a large amount of empty wrappers or containers, disruption in normal eating behaviors, which means, eating throughout the day with no planned meal times, skipping meals or taking small portions of food at regular meals, and engaging in sporadic fasting or repetitive dieting. When we're talking about orthorexia, it's an obsession with proper or quote unquote healthful eating. And when we're talking about this, we're not talking about, being aware and concerned with the nutritional quality and value of the food that you're consuming. It's actually something where somebody becomes fixated on what they're eating and what healthy actually means, that they're actually damaging their own well-being. So this can present as compulsive checking of ingredient lists and nutritional labels, obsessively following like health style blogs. I'm sure we all know on Instagram, that's a really big thing. Very, very large movement on there. Having the inability to eat anything but a narrow group of foods that are deemed healthy or pure, and showing really high levels of distress whenever these foods aren't made available or able to be found, even to the point where they spend hours of their day thinking about what food might be served at the next meal that's upcoming. OSFED is an other specified feeding or eating disorder. It encompasses those individuals who don't meet the strict, again, diagnostic criteria for anorexia nervosa or bulimia, but they have a significant eating disorder. AFRID, which is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, is similar to anorexia in that both disorders involve limitations in the amount or types of food consumed, but AFRID folks do not involve any distress about body shape or size. When we're talking about rumination disorder, this involves a regular regurgitation of food that occurs for at least 1 month. So regurgitated food can be rechewed, reswallowed, or spit out. Typically, when somebody regurgitates their food, they do not appear to be making an effort, nor do they appear to be stressed, upset, or disgusted. So, if their shelter residents are hanging out together and eating a meal, they're just chewing their food like normal, putting it into a napkin and continuing. It's a ritual around that, where it doesn't seem to be any sort of high stress. It's just they're tasting it, chewing it, and spitting it out. Pica is an eating disorder that involves eating items that are not typically thought of as food and that do not contain significant nutritional value. So this can present as persisted eating over a period of time, at least once a month, of substances that are not food. That can include paper, soap, cloth, hair, chalk, paint, metal, pebbles, starch, or chewing ice. This is also important because there can also be culturally supported foods that are not deemed as typical foods. So like some cultures promote eating clay as a medicinal practice. We're not talking about that context. We're talking about, again, a really common one is constantly chewing ice. Laxative abuse is pretty straightforward. It's when a person attempts to eliminate unwanted calories, lose weight, feel quote unquote thin or quote unquote empty through the repeated frequent use of laxatives. Compulsive exercise is when somebody's exercising to the point where it interferes with important activities, where it occurs at inappropriate times or in inappropriate settings. And this could present as somebody that has extreme discomfort with rest or inactivity, exercises using to manage their emotions, and that's their only way to manage their emotions. This isn't, I'm going to go blow off some steam, I'm going to go for a run. This is, I need to feel something, I'm going to run and then see what happens. And then they can also use exercise as a means of purging to get rid of or burn off calories from a binge. And they can also use exercise as permission to eat or not eat. So it can become, as you can tell, it can be a very unhealthy cycle. Unspecified feeding or eating disorder, again, applies to when folks have symptoms or characteristics of disorders that aren't able to be diagnosed by any one diagnostic class. And why this is all important is because it's all linked to trauma, right? So it reduces the hyperarousal or anxiety associated with trauma. It can numb, avoid, or even forget traumatic experiences. And it's, avoidant coping. It's self-punishment through thoughts and beliefs, which can be self-defeating and result in negative medical outcome. And it's active coping because it's a problem-solving style associated with better medical results for the individual. So again, this relates back to trauma because it's a way that they can see themselves as reclaiming their body, even though, as we just went through, they may not be the healthiest for their body in the long term, but it's a type of gaining power and control back over themselves.
And as we said before, and the ones that we've discussed or we've chosen to discuss in more detail, once again, are examples of things that we feel you're more likely to run into in residential programming and through direct service. And once again, these are representative of some of those coping, we mentioned before, dysfunctional coping, which is a direct result of trauma response. So eating disorder tends to be one of the most common ways that people engage in coping abuse. And so understanding those dynamics, once again, not in a clinical regard, but so that you are able to understand that if there are individuals that you're working with or you see that are engaging in what may seem like rule-breaking behavior, as Jessa mentioned, hoarding food, being in the bathroom too long before or after meals, things like that. These are things to always kind of look at through the lens of trauma and trying to understand how that may be traumatic response and not necessarily intentional rule-breaking behavior.
All right, so moving on to the next layer, we're going to talk about disassociation. And this is what happens whenever a person feels disconnected from their thoughts, feelings, memories, or sense of identity, actions, and surroundings. This is something that can be very common amongst the LGBTQ community, specifically trans, non-binary folks. And what this can present as is all of these things. So dissociative disorders usually develop as a reaction to trauma to help difficult memories to keep them at bay. It includes memory loss or amnesia of certain periods of time, events, people, personal information, sometimes even down to names. A sense of being detached from yourself and your emotions. So you're physically detaching yourself to what is happening to keep yourself safe as best as you can. You're feeling a sense of being detached from yourself and your emotions. Perception of the people and things around you are seen as distorted and unreal. It can also result in a blurred sense of identity. Again, not knowing who you are, what you really mean, what it means to be yourself, and having an inability to cope well with emotional or professional stress. So this is, Again, seeing those instant trauma reactions, because we know that trauma changes the brain. And if an individual isn't able to connect with themselves or their environment and they're disassociating from that, it's even harder to navigate a trauma response to be able to communicate effectively or engage in a healthy way with other people or their environments. So what's important to note about disassociation is at its baseline, it's a body, mind, and spirit break. And everybody does this. So if anybody has been sitting and you just zone out for a little bit, like daydreaming, for instance, you are physically removing yourself from a situation. You are no longer connected to your environment, sometimes not even to yourself. Some of you may be doing it right now during this webinar, and that is okay. But that is something that folks experience on a regular basis, just in day to day. So whenever we talk about it in the context of experiencing a trauma, particularly around, identities, and in an individual's relationship with themselves, this can present in all of these ways. So it can seem like they don't even know what happened to them, or they're no longer sure who they are or what that really means, or they're not engaging with staff or other folks in shelter appropriately, whatever that actually means, right? Because we're talking about it in the context of trauma. So all of that kind of strict stuff is out the door because we have to be flexible. And again, inability to cope, not having their coping capacities overwhelmed to begin with, because that's what trauma does. But when it's a prolonged thing like this, it can result in showing up in this way. Do you have anything you want to add?
Cool. I think that most frequently we may see this as a sense of detachment. And once again, just kind of taking this back to the work that we do direct service wise, these can be clients or residents that just don't seem to be connecting, as Jess said, either with staff or with other people within the program. And sometimes we may look at this as, we make snap judgments about those situations. So that person's just not really fitting in. They don't seem to, to engage when we're doing case review, things like that. When in actuality, that could be a disassociation coping skill that they're relying on in order to deal with the situation that they're in or trauma that's been activated since they have arrived. All right. So the next thing we want to talk about that is often very misunderstood is self-mutilation. These can include things like cutting and scratching the self, burning, pulling hair, hitting or banging their head, or simply not allowing injuries to heal. So picking at scabs and things like that. These can be pretty upsetting to witness, but often these function as a way to express negative emotions and to provide a temporary escape from them. So while they can be very off-putting to other people who are witnessing this behavior for the individual, they can actually be quite comforting. In particular, for individuals that experience flashbacks or other trauma activations, self-harm can actually provide a shock that helps them return to the present moment. So this can offset disassociation and actually allow that individual to come back into their body. Typically, self-injury is not a suicide attempt. And this is something that I think is very important for us to understand, because as I mentioned, this can be very upsetting to witness, especially cutting and scratching of the skin. We, as advocates, can feel like, oh my gosh, this is a cry for help. This is something that we need to do something about. But it's very important that when somebody is engaging in self-mutilation, specifically as a coping skill, that we avoid reacting to that disclosure of self-harm or to witnessing self-harm in the same way that we would with a suicide attempt, because they are oftentimes two very different things. Now, that said, if there's also an admission of things like suicidal ideation, hopelessness, things like that, then that bears discussion with regard to, referral to psychiatric services and things like that. But the reason that we wanted to take some time to talk about self-mutilation as a form of coping abuse is because it is very prevalent. Sometimes it's not going to look the way that it might on TV, for example. It may be something very simple. Pulling hair isn't always ripping giant clumps of hair out of the head, for example. There is a disorder that really is just pulling, individual strands of hair out of the head. This can eventually lead to bald patches and things like that. But that activity in and of itself can be comforting to the individual that's engaging in it. Once again, we're not clinicians, we're not here to diagnose this behavior, and we're not asking you to, but we do want you to understand some of these coping skills that are developed as a result of trauma and as a way to mitigate some of the impact of trauma. All right, so we're going to move on now to societal and systemic oppression. Many of these are things that we're already familiar with, like discrimination based on stereotypes, microaggression, but we do want to focus in a little bit on criminalization of survival behavior, because this is something that Jess and I both felt might need a little bit of explanation, just so you have a good understanding of what we mean. Obviously, others unable or unwilling to help is something that's pretty common with the individuals that we work with, because they're coming to shelter oftentimes without other options or opportunities. So that's a form of oppression that's very common, but we didn't feel like it bared a lot of detail since we see it very frequently. But when we talk about criminalization of survival behavior, some examples of that are individuals who engage in sex work, individuals who are engaging in substance use, shoplifting, or petty crime, or experience retaliation because of self-defense against their abuser. So let's talk about these things in a little bit more detail. Sex work. We're going to talk about the issue of human trafficking a little bit, and I want to make sure that we all understand that, you know, there are a lot of nuanced similarities and differences. When we refer to the term sex work, we're talking about, you know, commercial sex work, engaging in prostitution, any kind of activity that allows an individual to receive compensation for sexual activity. This is something that's criminalized, right? Prostitution is a crime. But we know that oftentimes these are things that are engaged in through exploitation. So the introduction into sex work and commercial sexual activity often occurs through exploitation from a family member, a partner, or an employer. This may be the only means for financial stability that an individual is able to engage in, particularly if they have an existing criminal record and no previous work history, for example. Prosecution and penalties are overwhelmingly, they fall onto the individual rather than the people who are purchasing sex or exploiting an individual to engage in commercial sex. There are more fines and more criminal charges that equals increased financial strain and the lower likelihood for alternative employment. So the criminalization of that particular kind of survival behavior oftentimes creates a vicious cycle that's very difficult for that individual to escape from. Another example of criminalization of a survival behavior might be substance use. So this is, as we all know, a very common form of coping with post-traumatic stress disorder and trauma. What tends to happen is that substance use and addiction leads to criminal charges related to substance use, which impacts the ability for an individual to find employment, to access support services, and oftentimes because of their substance use history, they may not be taken seriously by organizations or individuals that might be able to offer help and assistance. So this is a survival behavior that is oftentimes criminalized and creates more trauma and more difficulty for an individual who is engaging in that activity. Once again, as far as, criminalization, shoplifting, or petty crime, sometimes these are things that an individual may be exploited to engage in. Other times they may just be a part of that person's ability to get by. Shoplifting things like food, diapers, medication, things like that, may be a survival behavior that they have engaged in. And if they have charges related to those crimes, that can certainly impact their employment, their ability to move forward, and their ability to, move past that criminalization and into better employment, better living situation, et cetera. The last one that I wanted to talk about is retaliation or self-defense. And this is something that I think we've all had some experience with in advocacy work. Trauma survivors oftentimes carry criminal charges for defending themselves against their abuser. Police may unknowingly target individuals who've been experiencing abuse because they're portrayed as unstable, they're portrayed as having instigated an attack, they're portrayed as delusional. And once again, if we look so far at the layers of trauma that we've discussed, They may have a history of trauma. They may have a history of child abuse. They may have a coping skill that includes substance use. They may have a co-occurring mental health diagnosis. All of these things then add up to allow that abusive partner to make a good case that says, oh, this person has all of these maladaptive coping skills. They have bipolar disorder diagnosis. They're crazy. They're attacking me. They're the one that is creating all of this problem. I'm innocent. I'm sure all have, stories of survivors that have experienced this. And when those behaviors become criminalized, they must then carry the onus and responsibility of that on their criminal record, which can make it very difficult for them to get any kind of protection from abuse services moving forward, or to be taken seriously by law enforcement and other agencies. So these are other layers of trauma that we may see in the individuals that we're working with. And hopefully you're now starting to see the benefit of this tool and how all of these different things start to work together to create layers of trauma within an individual. Do you have anything to add to that one?
Now, the only thing is that I would add for substance use, we know that substance coercion can be also introduced. So that's also, puts into this, perfect storm for an abuser to be able to paint up somebody, where if they introduce substances into the relationship and is now being used to cope with the trauma that was induced through the substance coercion, through the, the interpersonal violence trauma, it can be compounded and make it that much more difficult that they're also struggling with the, feelings attached to being reminded of their abuser through substances as well.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and we may cover this in human trafficking in a second, which is actually an excellent segue into continuing trauma, but oftentimes a form of exploitation to engage in commercial sexual activity includes forced substance use, so addiction to opioids and things like that, that will keep somebody compliant and engaging in those activities. So when we talk about continuing trauma, human trafficking is certainly something that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. Other examples of continuing trauma are return to an abusive situation, either the existing abusive situation or one that feels similar. Because we know that, when somebody experiences trauma, especially if that started earlier in life, the abusive situation actually starts to become more familiar and comforting than what we would describe as a non-abusive or non-dysfunctional situation. Another example is poverty, a continuing form of trauma that impacts that individual, for a good span of the lifetime. And then things like homelessness, incarceration, and intergenerational grief. So once again, we're not going to cover all of these. And if you have questions about some of them, you're welcome to ask either after the webinar or in separate emails or phone calls to Jessa or myself. But very quickly, just to kind of review human trafficking, and we will be doing a webinar that will give more details about human trafficking in January. We'll be sending registration for that shortly. But just to kind of touch the surface of this issue as an ongoing or continuing form of trauma, we know that human trafficking includes sex trafficking, which is when an individual is forced through force, fraud, or coercion to engage in any form of commercial sex. And then labor trafficking, which is the use of force, fraud, or coercion to get somebody to engage in labor, often without payment or without proper compensation. And these are forms of continuing trauma. Oftentimes when somebody is a survivor of either form of human trafficking, this is something that impacts them for the lifespan. These are not short-term traumatic events. These are things that a person will carry with them. Engaging in commercial sex, for example, oftentimes is a lengthy recruitment period, followed by a lengthy amount of time that is spent through trauma bonding, getting very, very close and connected to a trafficker and other individuals who are being exploited by that trafficker. And it becomes a lifestyle that individual then, like we just discussed, it becomes a sense of comfort to them almost. It becomes what feels normal instead of something that is abnormal and should be disconnected from. So human trafficking is an example of something that will continue to impact that person. And oftentimes, especially as we mentioned, with the criminalization that tends to occur with regards to both sex and labor trafficking, that may then create a situation where that individual must return to those activities because there are no other options for them to be able to move forward.
Awesome. So poverty is a continuing trauma, right? It affects folks and their ability or inability to function in a capitalist system, which is what we live in, which is also, complicated by colonialist, heterosexist, racist, any type of ist lens, right, is corrupted. So the way that folks function in this and are impacted by this is a form of trauma. So when we're talking about poverty, PCADV bridges out a poverty definition. So when we're talking about folks that are experiencing poverty, it's those whose resources, which are material, cultural, and social, are so limited that they're excluded from the minimum acceptable way of life as a member in the state in which they live. So when we're talking about that, we're talking about the extent that one does without resources. When we're talking about that, we're talking about social capital, which are your connections, social networks, and norms, and trustworthiness in society. And your resources. Those resources include financial, which is obviously, being able to purchase goods and services, to function within the class system and sustain that lifestyle. Your emotional resources, which are being able to choose and control emotional responses, particularly to negative situations without engaging in self-destructive behavior, which, as we talked about, trauma severely impacts this piece. Mental, which is having the mental abilities and acquired skills in order to deal with and function in daily life. A spiritual resource, which is believing in divine or non-divine purpose and guidance. Physical, which is physical health and mobility. Support systems, having friends, family, and other resources to access in times of need. Relationships or role models, to have frequent access to these folks that are appropriate, nurturing, healthy, and don't engage in self-destructive behavior and are able to healthily support somebody that has some of these maladaptive coping skills. And understanding hidden rules, which is knowing the unspoken cues of habits of a particular group, which again is all tangled up into the larger capitalist system, the way the three class systems play out that can hinder folks' ability to engage in and function in an appropriate quote unquote way.
All right, and so we've covered in the criminalization of some of these behaviors, that incarceration obviously has an impact. So I'm not going to take a whole lot of time with this, but I do think it's really important for all of us to remember that incarceration in and of itself carries its own long-term sense of trauma. So for example, somebody doesn't just necessarily, get arrested, do their time in jail, be released, and then they've done their time, they feel better. Because of the nature of incarceration and the impact that can have on someone and their trauma, whether, no matter what somebody walks in there with, whether they don't have a whole lot of trauma to begin with or they have a boatload, incarceration in and of itself is a traumatic experience. People who have experienced incarceration, experience disempowerment. At the very roots of incarceration, we see disempowerment as the goal of that experience, making sure that the individual who is incarcerated does not have any power of their own on their own. That can have a huge impact on how somebody then is able to reintegrate into society after they have experienced incarceration. Obviously, we talked about this before, when somebody carries a criminal record, their ability to maintain or even achieve employment is impacted, and their ability, especially if they carry a felony offense, to have gainful employment can be severely impacted, and that can last for their entire life. And finally, even without any of those other issues, the stigma of having been incarcerated is significant. This is often something that people do not feel comfortable disclosing and may feel a lot of trauma because of the social stigma attached to incarceration. So this is something that we need to be aware of when we're working with individuals who have experienced incarceration, who have loved ones who have experienced incarceration, because this does have a very serious long-term and ongoing traumatic impact.
All right, so getting to the end of the list here with intergenerational grief. What we mean by that is the transmission of trauma to a given family suffering a loss or shared response to a societal trauma or historical oppression. So when we're talking about transmission, we're talking about circulation of injury among people in more equivalent power relations. For example, this could show up as colonialization, as racism for Holocaust survivors, the LGBTQ community, and Native populations. And the ways that this can present are anxiety, guilt, perceived obligation to share in communal pain, being unable to openly acknowledge or publicly mourn, again, these historical shared responses. Societal disenfranchisement of grief, for when we're talking about it in this context, can result in a lot of anger, sadness, and shame around, again, identity, which then can pair back into disassociation. And it also impacts relationship with the individual self, their own community, but also the larger societal community as well. So that's also something that we thought was important to kind of spread out and talk through what that actually meant.
And so we're going to move into using the tool in practice, but just to kind of wrap up this section, we're really hopeful that all of you can take a look at this tool and now start to apply it to yourselves, to the clients that you work with, to every individual that you interact with, because, as we can see, there are lots of layers, and we've talked about this in numerous trainings. You've heard this before. There are many layers of trauma, but this tool really helps us look at what those layers actually mean, how they interact with one another, and how they may present in clients. So we just have a couple of examples before we wrap up for the afternoon to kind of help you start thinking about what this multiple layer of trauma could look like with the clients that we work with. So we're going to give you a couple of examples, and we want you to just kind of think through the situation, and then we're going to kind of break it down a little bit. So this first scenario, I know you all can read, but I'll just read through it really quickly. A 65-year-old woman is referred from the hospital after disclosing that her husband was physically abusive. She arrives without dentures and would not allow the nurses at the hospital to wash her hair. She refuses to use her walker and has mobility issues that make it very difficult for her to navigate throughout the shelter. And during her intake, she becomes very incoherent and fearful. She begins rocking back and forth and does not respond to questions. So really quickly, if you're in a group, I just want you to kind of talk for a couple seconds about this situation and some of the things that you might think about at first glance with this situation. What are the preconceived notions that we might have about this woman? While you guys are talking through this, I'll give you some examples. So we may think that, she's experiencing some dementia, because sometimes that's what we assume when somebody is of a certain age and they're experiencing behavior that we think is unusual, arriving without dentures. Maybe she forgot them because she's experiencing dementia. We might make an assumption that because she's becoming incoherent and fearful and rocking back and forth, that there's some kind of a mental health disorder that's going on. So let's take a look at the background of the situation. Her husband is emotionally, physically, and sexually abusive. He would move the walker out of her reach as a form of punishment. This survivor stopped bathing and using her dentures in an effort to stop the sexual abuse. And she has severe post-traumatic stress disorder from long-term abuse, including flashbacks that are easily activated when she's stressed. So this is an example of how understanding the potential for multiple layers of trauma can unlock our ability as advocates to experience a higher level of empathy. Sometimes we have to be aware of our own biases and the things that we carry with us. This is what we do as advocates every day. But being able to consult that multi-abuse tool will allow us to look at some of the possibilities that an individual may be walking around with, as we said, and help us to look at a situation without jumping to a conclusion about why they may be acting or reacting in a certain way. Even though we oftentimes will, we're advocates, we understand that almost everything has to do with trauma, but it may not be the primary trauma that is creating the reactions that we're seeing.
So building on that, here's another scenario. Again, we're not going to take a whole lot of time, but I'm going to read it to you, even though I know you can read. A 32-year-old woman calls in seeking legal advocacy assistance. She wants protection from her wife, who has become increasingly physically abusive since they got married 6 months ago. When the advocate begins going through options for PFA, the woman becomes angry and says she thought the advocate could just get her the protection order. But what we don't know is the background to this, right? So we have our perceived ideas of, what our thoughts towards this survivor may look like, right? Because that's how this works. It's our own trauma response. It's our own advocacy responses, our own experience coming into play. And I'm sure folks have heard this before. I know I certainly have of, what do you mean I have to go? You can't do this. That's why I'm calling you, right? So what things that we may not ever get to or to know is that this woman had several bad experiences when applying for her marriage license at the courthouse, which included racial profiling, microaggressions, and intrusive questions and jokes about her sexuality. So again, as Michelle said, this is a baseline example where you may not think, oh, this is a trauma response happening. I'm going to look at my tool and apply this, but starting to think beyond that, right? Because it's everywhere. It's hidden, it's steeped. Again, just the societal systemic oppression piece can bring a lot of additional layers in for folks. So it's really important to, whenever you're looking at situations with survivors, to really expand your lens, to be more inclusive in your approach, to understand as best you can the different experiences that they may hold or come to you with, aside from just the presenting piece, which is the service-seeking portion of domestic violence service.
And in the previous webinar, we took some time to really talk about how when we understand and address our own trauma, we can, better look at and understand other people's trauma. So once again, we'll always ask you to ask yourself the question, when you're having a reaction to someone, is it activating your trauma? So this particular scenario is one that I think many advocates experience. Somebody gets upset with you because you're not able to do something for them, and that can activate our trauma sometimes. That can make us feel like, well, who's this person? They're so entitled. Why are they mad at me? And that activates our trauma response because, nobody likes to feel like they're not doing a good job. So we need to sometimes have the ability and the tools and resources to take a step back, to say, you know what, this is activating my trauma in a certain way, but let me see if I can, take a step back and understand a little bit better what's going on. We're not saying that every individual is going to disclose their many layers of trauma to you. They probably won't. And that's why this tool is so important as a reminder that when our clients are acting and reacting in ways that don't make sense to us or that are activating our own personal trauma, we don't get to know why, but we do get to understand the nature of trauma and its many layers. And so let that tool, if nothing else, be a visual reminder to you of everything that we walk around with every day.
Yeah, so that leads perfectly into the best practice section, right? So now we are going to go over those. So for best practices, right? Self-care. I know everyone is tired of hearing about self-care. It's talked about so much to advocates, right? That's all we ever hear about, self-care, self-care, self-care. But as we addressed in the last webinar, when we're talking about self-care, we're talking about the self-awareness, meaningful self-care to nurture yourself and be aware of your own trauma. Because we know that everyone already carries around their own version of trauma, some experience with it, including us as advocates, right? We bring our own experiences of our life on top of the secondary trauma that we experience working in trauma every day. So, engaging in meaningful self-care and to grow your own self-awareness is really going to help to decrease some of those intrusive thoughts whenever we're having our own trauma response and working with survivors as well.
Absolutely. And we need to make sure that we're creating our individual self-care plans that are unique to us, that allow us to engage in this work that we're doing in a meaningful way. And so if that's taking mindful moments, if that's doing yoga, that's your jam, that's fine. But if it's, closing your door for 10 minutes and listening to music that you like, or, giving yourself permission to go for a walk at lunch, or taking time off from work, whatever that is to you that helps you engage with your work in a way that doesn't burn you out, that's self-care.
Yes. Another important thing is resources, right? So we have shared multiple resources with you between these 2 webinars, like the self-care wheel, the ACEs handout to understand the adverse childhood experiences study, and now the multi-abuse trauma tool. To be sure to include these tools in your daily advocacy, as Michelle has said, and, allow it to serve that trauma exists in layers, right? And they may not always be disclosed to you. And it's important to have that larger lens of understanding when taking an approach to provide the best type of trauma-informed services that you can.
And it's very important. So the reason that we wanted to offer this webinar today is to help you understand the multi-abuse tool, because we realize that it can be fairly simple at a glance, but to understand how that can be useful and meaningful to you, when you understand these tools and when you start to really take a deep dive into them, look at them, really learn to understand them, you can then integrate them into your work. So that means that you can start using these tools in trainings, in your conversations regarding trauma, and most importantly, in your interactions with clients. So if you, hopefully, after watching this webinar, this multi-abuse trauma tool makes more sense to you, and it's something that you can now start to consider as a training tool or resource yourself. If not, that's fine, because Jessa and I are here as training and technical assistants to help you understand these resources better. So if you would like to have further training, if you want to have a conversation, if you want to talk through some of the resources that we've shared with you, that's why we're here. And we want to make sure that you're able to integrate these into your work and to help them as part of your self-care and as part of the advocacy that you do every day.
Yeah, so we're going to open up for questions, but I'm going to put our contact information up here so that folks can write it down. If you, again, have any questions, just want to say hello, please reach out. That's why we're here. We love hearing from you. And again, if you have any direct questions about anything we've handed out or talked about, or want to process anything, we are here. That is why we exist. So please reach out.
Yep. And if you have any direct questions now, feel free to type them into the chat box.
Yes.
Or if you want to tell us what a great job we did, that's fine too.
All right, well, there doesn't seem to be any questions, so we won't keep anyone longer than already long. So thank you everyone for joining us for our second part of our webinar. It's been great. We will talk to you soon.
Yep. Thanks again.